All right, if I could just say that we've invited people from really various parts of the world, and not everybody was able to come. However, what many people have done who haven't been able to come in person is that they've sent us papers, and so that all of these sessions are going to be a combination of papers given by the people that have written them, and papers that are here in absentia, and the chairs of the sessions will try and make some sort of summary of those. Now, inevitably, what's happened with that sort of arrangement is that the sessions aren't even. And this first session only has 3 people here who are actually going to be presenting papers, and then I'm afraid you'll have to listen to me talk about the papers written by people who aren't here. But I think there's been important points brought up in these other papers, and it'll be very worthwhile to actually talk about that. The other 2 sessions have a much better balance, where most of the speakers are actually here. So what I'd like to do for session 1 is begin then with the speakers who are here, and then I'll come in at the end with my summary, and we'll then open it up for discussion. So Peter, would you like to begin?
Okay. Can I have Yeah, we were probably a little remiss in not saying what the 3 sessions were. It may be obvious from the little handout, but we thought the first session would grow. I mean, there's basically 2 areas of teaching, well, probably 3 areas of teaching or involvement that Dalibor had. One was the MPhil seminars, MPhil PhD seminars. The other was the diploma studio. So that's session 1 and session 2 approximately. And then he was constantly working with people who'd been in either the studios or the seminars after they'd gone off into what in school is always called the real world. Right. So I'm going to do a very terse concentration on one part of my little piece. I was concerned Rafael Moneo made a comment that many people make, that architecture is losing out to the other media. Is that true? On the one hand, you can say, yes, a lot of the culture is kind of flattened. We know a lot of detail, but the depth is ambiguous. And in the face of, competition from specialisms in technology or science, planning regs, so on and so forth, Dalibor always held to what he called occasionally called the cosmic conditions. It was a little bit embarrassing to use a term like that because, of course, cosmos is just astronomy these days. But this seemed to me to be one of the key elements that oriented his thinking on city, on architecture, on people, on how meanings could be communicated. That, in fact, our history is always obliged to the cosmic conditions. Possibly inspired by Gadamer's notion of our elevated adaptive capacities, i.e. Gadamer made the point in one of the essays on practice that because of bureaucracy, technology, and so forth, our capacity to situate ourselves with respect to something like the cosmic conditions had become attenuated or flattened. Possibly also in response to Heidegger's notion of the forgetting of being, i.e. through our techniques of understanding, really since the Enlightenment, we have made being the most difficult topic to bring up. Dalibor came up with the term latent order. And what's of course interesting about this term latent is that it's the cosmic conditions that are hidden in it. And I would suggest that it's been hidden in kind of three ways. First of all, it's simply embedded in everyday praxis, typical situations, whose paradigmatic element allows for communication with what I'm calling the cosmic conditions. What I'm showing on the screen is not what you would probably call, or what Dalibor would show as a typical situation, but I use it for a particular reason. You read these things from right to left, and it's 6 scholars, and you'll see that the guy on the right is sort of staring at nature into probably a river or a stream. The 4 guys in the middle are involved in the game of Go. I would suggest that all involvements, what Merleau-Ponty calls perception of, I call involvement with, are agonic. There's always a claim made by that with which you're involved, whether it's, a bottle of water, another person, or even yourself. When you start thinking about yourself, you become strange to yourself. And the guy on the left is reading. And so in a kind of horizontal stratification from embodiment to articulation, from earth to world, this curious image about which, if anybody knows anything more than I do, which is would have to be quite a bit, I would be interested to know more about what I think it's late Tang, but that's irrelevant. The second area of latency or reason for latency has to do with the theme brought up by, Husserl, crisis, Ricoeur, Heidegger, question of technology, the degree to which our thinking about being, thinking about reality is governed by concepts that have come out of the long history from the Enlightenment through, Kant to the reactions to it in Romanticism, so on and so forth. It's occasionally said of Dalibor that he kind of hated technology. I don't think that's quite right. I think he was very interested in particularly the themes with which the sciences were involved. And what he was much more concerned with was how to reconcile them with, our cultural activities. Curiously, this is what Latour is doing in Politics of Nature, but we're not going to get into that. And certainly Dalibor never brought it up. And many of the configurations in the designs were the reciprocity between these different spheres, the kinds of people they were, the kinds of cultures they represented. And this would go for urban plans as well as for, even individual rooms. And the third area of latency is probably the most difficult. The degree to which something, the radical generality of space, which attempts to accommodate everything and passes for a kind of substitute for culture itself in architecture, how to deal with the tradition of meanings, the fragments. They seem to be floating there to be used opportunistically. Of course, once one started working with Dalibor, one realized that it wasn't quite so opportunistic, that there was a depth, there was a kind of hierarchy, that the more primitive conditions enabled one to be sophisticated, and so on and so forth. And the receptacle for this, I would argue, and as you'll see later this morning, Moisen and I think a couple of others would also agree, Dalibor used Prague as a kind of memory theater. First of all, it's an ancient city. Second of all, the way it's structured, how public life is a continuum from, it's not simply outside and inside, public-private. It's a much more diverse spectrum and touches on, embodies, and we're going to have to talk about this because embodiment is the theme that I think everybody has taken away from the course. The cultural possibilities, the limits and possibilities. And I would probably finish off by saying that if the Heideggerian earth and world, strife of earth and world, captures what Dalibor phrased as embodiment and articulation or conditions and possibilities, or the early Heidegger Da and Sein, there is no such thing as kind of earth by itself. It's always implicated with world, i.e., earth is always already architecture, and it's a matter of how to play with it rather than to kind of invent some new world. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. This is a fantastic treat and experience to be here and to be back in Cambridge for many of us who have been away for a long time. In chapter 2 of Architecture in the Age of Divided Representation, Dalibor paid a brief visit to Chartres, to the West Portal, with his lavish sculptural program. And one of the amazing things about this portal, as you all know probably, is the way the sculptures somehow merge with the columns, becoming, Dalibor wrote, their more articulate equivalents. Dalibor traced the layers of meaning present in the portal, its iconography, its role as an emblematic gate to heavenly Jerusalem, its ceremonial role in the religious life of the church, etc. And he pointed to the seamless way that sculpture, architecture, religious practice, historical memory come together in the portal, and how the different modes of representations and layers of meaning infiltrate each other, impossible completely to pin down or to distinguish or to taxonomize, but eminently real. To me, Dalibor's little reflection on a cathedral threshold somehow seemed to sum up what I learned from him over those 4 or 5 years that I worked with him. Namely, to start, and I'll undoubtedly never finish, to start understanding the rich and complex relationship between cultural meaning and the built world. And the piece, when I went back to it now, also seemed to sum up to me what the Cambridge program was, namely a threshold to architecture. An architecture that was infinitely richer than the one I had previously encountered during my architectural education. I had studied architecture and philosophy for 8 years before I came to Cambridge, and yet it was here that the pieces came together, for me as for so many others. Cambridge became, to steal Dalibor's phrase, our more articulate equivalent. And perhaps that's why it felt so natural when I was asked to contribute to a festschrift to Dalibor, edited by José de Paiva, to write about precisely a threshold. Quite a different kind of threshold, admittedly, namely Sverre Fern's museum at Hamar, set in what was once a medieval palace and later an agricultural building. Fern's museum is structured as a walk. It's an architectural promenade through space and time. And at one particular moment in this walk, this concrete ramp comes out to get you. It sort of lands lightly on this medieval cobblestone floor with its pointy concrete corner. And it's such a thrilling moment, not so much for the way it looks as for the way it feels. Because you come from this with your feet over these smooth but slightly wobbly medieval cobblestones, and suddenly your feet now traverse onto rough but totally even 20th century concrete, on which you are lifted, as it were, above history. Of course, it's a little bit problematic what goes on here. You could assume that this was about reducing history to something being observed from above, as it were. Yet somehow the intensity of your bodily experience saves it. Your eyes are always checked in this museum by the involvement of your body. The seer, as Merleau-Ponty put it, is immersed in the visible by his body. This is obviously not Chartres, but somehow both these thresholds seem to strive to connect the past to the present, the earth to the sky. And one of the things that Dalibor taught was to recognize this striving, to appreciate the extraordinary work that goes into creating these kinds of connection. The West Portal at Chartres is a testimony to such a work. But so is, and this is important, so is Dalibor's own description of it. Architectural embodiment, Dalibor wrote, still writing on his Chartres portal, manifests itself in the vertical organization of the portal, in the spatial arrangement of the iconography, and even, he says, in the language that I am using now when I discuss the portal. So, like the way the sculptures take the place of columns at Chartres, language can sometimes be brought on to serve as architecture's more articulate equivalent, not to replace or to construct, but to reveal and articulate. And by opening the possibility for such an articulation, Cambridge, and Dalibor himself, I think, was indeed a threshold to the world of architecture. Thank you very much.
Hello, I too am very pleased to be back here in Cambridge and to see all of you. My contribution today is about the home and studio of Dalibor. I was very pleased that the family very kindly allowed me to access into the flat, which is still there temporarily, to try to record and interpret it. I'm very thankful also to the photographer Will Price, who has come along and taken some very good pictures of the flat, which I'll show you in a moment. This is a very brief summary of what turned out to be quite a long paper, so I hope you'll have a look at it on the website. Right. I felt slightly anxious, I must say, wandering around the flat, wondering whether Dalibor would feel it somehow intrusive for someone to be nosing around his things without him there. But I hope that it's been justified, because I think the arrangement of the flat reveals something about maybe another layer of Dalibor's thought and his life. Especially his interest in the metaphorical quality of fragments and their ability to structure a thematic field. The place really does contain a world, a whole culture within the home. It contains Dalibor's near 7,000 volume library. There's also a collection of artifacts of art and student work, antique folk pottery. Most of these things are gifts, so they have a personal meaning, and lots of personal memorabilia of different sorts, chronicling a whole lifetime. That's the picture of the building, kind of international style building. Dalibor's flat was on the top left, and in this sketch plan, I'm focusing mostly on this area of the study. Right, this is that study with the hearth wall. So the building is very stripped down, modern, stripped of most symbolic elements. The flat is quite modest, but Dalibor's approach is to work situationally to create a thematic content through things like the color scheme, the infill elements that were put in, and the arrangements of the collection. I would just like to begin, I suppose, by saying that growing up under the authoritarian communist regime, Dalibor, I think, felt the need to challenge existing orthodoxy and develop this drive towards independent thought, as Drahos has emphasized. The official line then was one of technological and social progress, and which by that time when the boys were young, had become quite hollow. And so I think that that casts an interesting light. Certainly modern art and philosophy were considered to be quite dangerous, subversive. And I think Dalibor's affinity with phenomenology and surrealism, both of which are concerned with human liberation, can be seen in that light. Important here is Dalibor's belief in the harmful split in modern culture, which it has since been unable to overcome. The Baroque, of course, is significant. In it, Dalibor saw perhaps the last time in Western culture that there was a coherent whole, and architecture was a richly communicative medium. At the same time, he, of course, had a love of certain strands of early 20th century art, particularly things like Cubism and Surrealism, which prized the role of the imagination and explored the primary phenomena of perception, spatiality, and metaphor. I think looking at the flat, one is reminded strongly of the 17th century culture of curiosities, the cabinets of curiosities, which was very close to Dalibor's heart, I know. The idea that there's a sense of wonder that has to be part of scientific inquiry, and of course the importance of analogy in such an understanding. These cabinets tend to be microcosmic evocations of a world, a room structured to evoke a cosmos, and it's also very close, of course, to the surrealist collections, which Dalibor knew very well. Here, I just wanted to point to the Turgot plan on the wall here of the study. It's one of two large drawings, large prints of cities. The city, of course, which is very important for Dalibor's work. For him, traditional culture had its fullest and most lasting embodiment in the European city, and Prague, as has been said, was very significant, generative in this respect. The traditional city, which he always saw as inseparable from theater and from festival, featured strongly in the library and in much of the work, the design work and so forth. The civic order manifest in the public realm, understood as situational ground, was key. Here are some familiar images. Freud's study, of course, André Breton in his own studio with his collection. Here are some objects from Dalibor's collection, and this is an image of Dalibor visiting the private museum of the Czech surrealist filmmaker Jan Švankmajer in 2008, where there was a lot of discussion about the validity of private museums and collecting and so forth. Dalibor's flat can be understood in terms of the modern concern with the culture of dwelling, I think, with the growing impoverishment of public space in the public realm of the industrial city. There's a new significance being attributed to the private realm, a shift of focus to the private domain, and we get this introverted culture, which Dalibor also, of course, wrote about in his book. Culture being assembled now in the home and in the studio through collecting and through the sensibility of the secular sacred. This is evident already in Freud's collection. The surrealist collections were very influenced by Freud, but they were more concerned, the surrealists were more concerned with how meaning is generated through unexpected displacements and juxtapositions, through objective chance, through spatial relationships, and this is something that I know Dalibor was very important, very concerned with when it came to architectural design. So for Dalibor, his own collection, I think, is a kind of personal theater of memory, akin very much to the surrealist collections. The other strand one should mention is the artist studio, the culture of the artist studio, which Dalibor and Drahos were very much acquainted with in Prague, which is a very interesting theme in 19th and 20th century culture. The import of that here, I think, under the totalitarian regime must have been strengthened. The studios were often places, the kind of semi-private places of subversive and hidden activity. So they became meeting places, workshops and galleries, but also performance places and places of illicit publication and so forth. In these images, it's an interesting early image that was lent to me by the Veselys of Dalibor in the 60s with colleagues and friends. I think a lot of this kind of thing went on in artistic studios around Prague. This is the studio of Dalibor's father, Josef Vesely, the painter, which the boys were well acquainted with, and some more recent pictures of Dalibor in artist studios. So I think that there is a dimension within the flat, which also had performances in it. And finally, I'd like to speak about this notion of the thematic content of the flat. It's structured through a number of typical situational settings, places for daily activities, scaled according to the body. Dalibor, of course, was very interested in what he called the play of positive fragments and their remarkable power to structure an analogical field, a kind of thematic or communicative world. And I will conclude by showing you a couple of these. One is the entry to the flat and the study here. One gets a sense from the positions of the books and the coloring and the colors and so forth of entering the lair of a musician and a kind of dispenser of arcane knowledge and someone who's very interested in the sensory world of cubist spatiality. The color scheme of the flat is interesting, and I think there is a relationship there with the color schemes of the Baroque. Baroque interiors tend to use colors and materials according to a symbolic tradition related to the cosmic order. So you get the three cosmic levels, with the lowest being the horizontal, the human, very tactile kind of chthonic level, usually expressed in dark materials, dark wood, and so on. And one sees something similar within the flat, most notably with three large areas of this very dark, intense sienna red color associated with fire, both literal in case of the hearth and the opening into the kitchen, but also more metaphorical. There's an area of this red color surrounding the head of Dalibor's bed. Another one of these situational settings is around the hearth and the seating area. The hearth, obviously an important situation with secular sacred overtones. It's the primordial center of dwelling and reputed origin of architecture if you follow Vitruvius. It's created here by this collection of quasi-sacred objects around the little fire pit, the hearth, with various ecclesiastical objects, the candlesticks, and some Baroque fragments, pictures. And there's a collection of interesting objets à réaction poétique nearby. And then the area of the desk, which is a kind of summary of a vita contemplativa, paradigmatic situation used by Dalibor to illustrate the order of non-perspectival embodied space. This is also something, by the way, that Corbusier talks about, and we discussed during my work on spatiality. So, fond memories. Interestingly, there's also on display some of Dalibor's architectural tools. These intimately tactile tools recall certain metaphysical still lives or Le Corbusier's own evocations of the contemplative life. the second bedroom, which was Frosso's room, where there's a collection of books on archaic and ancient cultures. It has this cast of Akore from the Parthenon, from the Acropolis. Akore is a smiling maiden who's a kind of attendant of the goddess. And here she is. I have to determine exactly where it came from, but no doubt it had personal significance. And then finally, totalitarianism in the toilet. Even the toilet has thematic overtones. There's a collection of books on authoritarianism and totalitarian expression. Evil is portrayed and architecture's complicity in it, I suppose. And there's a wonderful collage, I have to find out who made it, of human bondage by a repressive mechanism. So that's everything. Just to sum up then, that it's interesting, I think, that even in the home, and particularly in the home, there's a dimension of thematic content and a play of fragments creating a world. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Now, we have these 6 papers and nobody here to give them. And I must say, I deliberated on whether to just summarize them, but in the end, I decided that really wasn't a very interesting thing to do. And they are all on the website, so you can certainly read them. I will say they cover a lot of different areas as well. And so the question of how do you summarize them and bring them together is a bit of a puzzle. In the end, I thought probably the most useful thing was to go through a number of themes that I would imagine everyone in the room will recognize, but I'll try and pick up on how the different authors have touched upon these themes. And in doing so, I will raise some questions that you might want to take and follow in the discussion. I mean, you don't have to, but it's simply a possibility. Now, we'll leave the images just for a minute. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to say about all of these papers is that they're all personal tributes, and people have made their tributes in different sorts of ways. But it's been very lovely to read those. But one of the things that people really focus on the most, I think, is Dalibor as a teacher. And how important his teaching has been to so many generations of students. Alberto Pérez Gómez stresses orality, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, we know that Dalibor was often criticized for not publishing enough, and then finally, when he did publish his wonderful book, that came out relatively late in his career. But I think what Alberto is saying is that the whole tradition of orality was so important. And this is one of the things that really makes a true teacher. I think probably we could add to that the whole use of a dialogical tradition that Dalibor felt very, very strongly about, and that was quite a strong feature of well, the whole supervision system, but certainly the kind of life that went on in the department, and the sorts of discussions that students had amongst themselves, following on from the MPhil seminar and some of the other events, and that was also a very, very important aspect of the studio. But orality itself, I mean, Dalibor's own sense of orality, his ability to speak in a way that was so lucid and so comprehensive, I think was incredibly important. I mean, Ken Frampton brings up a really interesting little memory of Dalibor. And this has to do with Ken inviting Dalibor to write an article in a special issue that he was editing on modernism. And Dalibor refused to do that. And his excuse for not doing it was that actually Paul Ricoeur had already said what Ken Frampton was trying to say, and that Ricoeur did it much better. Which, when I first read that, I thought, my goodness, that was a bit brash. But I mean, Ken took this in a very, very gracious sort of way, and he sat down and he read the essay by Ricoeur, and actually did agree that Ricoeur probably was saying it better than he had. And actually, because of Dalibor's recommendations, I mean, this developed into a lot. He says a lot of discussion and a very nice friendship between the two men. I think the next thing that comes out very clearly in the papers has to do with communicative space. That is something that we've already had mentioned, of course, this morning. I mean, both Peter and, well, actually all three of the speakers have talked about communicative space. And Dagmar and Peter have both brought up the influence of Prague itself as a city, a whole city in which Dalibor felt that communicative space could be seen. That was something quite palpable, and I think that's important. I think that the question of how the flat becomes communicative is a really interesting one. I think one question that I would perhaps bring up, and that's maybe something that you'll respond to, is it really a cabinet of curiosities, or is it much more a communicative space in the sense that it is really very structured, and not so much the idea of whatever happens to arrive, you put in your cabinet as the curiosities. But as I say, that's something that perhaps we can. Do you want to do it now? Yeah, all right. Yeah, why don't we? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the cabinets of curiosities are an important precedent because of the way that nature is represented, i.e. not divided into artificial categories. But I think there's an element of the cabinet of curiosities in Dalibor's collecting, as there is with, I mean, collecting is very, very prevalent amongst surrealists and amongst architects in the 20th century. It's nothing that unique about that, but I think that it's a mixture of things. So it's not a systematic collection in any way. Well, perhaps the books, but the other objects are collected. They're mostly things with personal meanings. Most of them are gifts, so there isn't a kind of rational system operating.
Yeah, no, systematic, no.
Systematic,
I
no.
think that was probably a word that was banished from the
Yes,
vocabulary
yes.
with
So-
respect to this,
But I think
but structured.
Structured and the way that it plays with memory, I mean personal memory, I think theater of memory is perhaps a good description of it. That and I mean, having looked at the work of André Breton, the kind of environment that he worked in was very important to feeding into his work, and I suspect that something similar may have gone on with Dalibor as he was sitting there, obviously, looking at these things.
Okay. I think with communicative space, we very quickly get to the idea of this structuring the world through embodiment and articulation. And Peter mentioned this as a very important point, both in terms of the concern for embodiment, but the idea that embodiment doesn't exist alone. I mean, there is never simply the earth. It's always part of the world, and the capacity for latent space, which is absolutely critical. I mean, I think at this point we are all obsessed with embodiment. I mean, this is just something that is very, very much part of our culture today. Karsten Harries talks about it in historical terms, and he refers to Dalibor's work on medieval cathedrals and Guarini. I think as architects, we're particularly obsessed with embodiment. That just simply goes with the territory, but I don't think it's restricted only to architecture. And I think generally, as human beings living in the beginning of the 21st century, I mean, the whole, in a world that's becoming increasingly virtual, obviously the question of embodiment is something that in one way or another it bothers a lot of people. But I mean, I think certainly the question of the physical and in relationship to the articulate world, the question of philosophical embodiment and articulation is something that is absolutely critical in Dalibor's work, and it's very, very easy at this point to forget the articulated side. And I don't know if Peter, if you want to add to that at this point. You said it very, very clearly in what you were saying. Okay, good.
This is going to be something that
We'll come back to quite a lot, I think. I mean, praxis, I think, then is something interesting too, as certainly more embodied behavior. Mary was stressing the possibilities of the participative act. I think this is another area that we're absolutely concerned with today. How do we participate? And I don't know if you want to add at this point or leave it. Okay. But I think one of the questions that I would have probably for everyone here, and that's to what extent we can equate everyday life and praxis. I mean, it seems to me that there's some real problems in that equation. Everyday life is a term that is used very, very regularly. Praxis probably less so. Practical life or practical activities are used, but what happens in most usage today, at least in my experience, is that we get a situation where there is a polarization, that things are either philosophical or theoretical, or they are practical. Things are in the world of policy, or they are in the world of practice and everyday life. And that seems to be inherently problematic, and I think that's something that needs to be probed. Now, to move to something rather different, but I think certainly worth mentioning, and that has to do with the role of Christianity. David Leatherbarrow wrote a primarily descriptive piece that was based on a visit that he took to a forest with sculptures when he was with Dalibor in northern Bohemia. And he shows these two photographs of the sculptures in the forest. Now, he then goes on to talk about a piece by Anselm Kiefer, and I think they're linked through the idea of May Day festivals, and Leatherbarrow is rather interested in the combination of the pagan festivals and yet at the same time the Christian festivals. And he talks about the easy interaction between the two of them and then kind of leaves it at that, but he implies that there's a synthesis of the cultures. Jose de Paiva in his paper seems to be pushing much harder on religious significance, and he tries to equate the idea of embodiment in Gadamer's work with the incarnation. I think we found that.
No, he says that he quotes Gadamer to the effect that embodiment is not incarnation.
That embodiment is not incarnation,
Yes.
but with de Paiva, I think there's a very strong sense of incarnation in this.
Yeah. He's definitely trying to drive a Christian and Jesuitical distinction between embodiment as something that kind of anybody would use, and incarnation, which comes out of Latin, roughly meaning enfleshment. So as close to embodiment as anybody would want, I should think.
Yeah.
And certainly, if you read John of Damascus, you're in a world that's in which embodiment is not simply, appropriation to the body, or the themes of the 80s and 90s of one's body that was that ran through all of literature. It's a much wider world that involves the nature of images, the nature of one's possible communication with the hidden God, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked Jose about this, and I didn't get a reply. But
Yeah.
I think there's scope for. The question that Paiva raises is whether we're being blasphemous or sacrilegious by not making the kind of distinction, i.e., how specifically Christian and Roman Catholic should one be? And that's a different question.
Yeah, and I think, as far as this is concerned, that is the question. Because I think for many of us, we have considered to what extent Dalibor's work and this sort of thinking, which comes very, very much out of the Western tradition, but is it something that can be applied to non-Western traditions, i.e., the whole rest of the world? And I think it's a difficult problem. I mean, to some extent, we can say yes, probably it can, but does that make it so generalized and almost generic that it starts to lose a lot of its meaning? Certainly, when you start to interpret it in specifically Christian terms, without the kind of synthesis that Leatherbarrow is referring to, or at least I think I'm kind of reading between the lines, but I think this is what he's referring to, and that it makes it much more specific and much less relevant. And is that something that we can live with in the kind of world that we're in today? Because certainly the world is changing very quickly, and there are these particular issues that we need to be addressing. How do we speak beyond the Western tradition? So for me, this is one of the very big questions, and I think probably worth some discussion. I have a couple of other points. Oh, yes. I think the point about authenticity in Robin Middleton's paper, which is an interesting question to take up. Because Robin says, as much as he always respected Dalibor's ideas and so on and so forth, that he's always been very puzzled and disagrees with what he thinks Dalibor is saying about the authenticity of the Rococo. And Middleton is claiming that the Rococo is essentially a secularization of the Baroque, that it comes out of the Baroque style completely, and therefore cannot be called authentic. Now, that raises just the whole problem of can we use the word authentic with in any sort of meaningful way? Should we be talking about things in terms of authenticity? But it seems to me that one of the things that Dalibor talked about a lot was the idea that culture is reinterpreted, and that perhaps the most creative point in any culture is that point of reinterpretation. That it's not something that starts with zero in the modern sense, and that it's reinterpretation. It's not really authenticity that we should be worrying about. So we can give one point to Dalibor on that problem. But I think then, and the whole question of if we want to talk in authentic terms, the jury probably remains out. But that may be something that you would like to raise. I think those are the main points that I would like to talk about right now, and I'm getting a bit tired, actually, of hearing myself speak. And so I think what I'd like to do is, first of all, open it to the panel if there are further comments that you would like to make, and otherwise open it to the floor.
Just a little comment on the sort of eternal dialogue between the embodiment and articulation, because the tiny little passage that I drew attention to in my 5-minute paper, the little meditation on the threshold in Chartres, and I just want to encourage you to go back to that, because it's such a beautifully handled way of saying, you know, this cannot be taxonomized, this cannot be separated, this can only be seen as dimensions of a totality. But there it could be very carefully pieced out, partially through language. And so it's a very, very beautiful passage where he, in a way, goes right to the heart of that discussion. So I'll give Dalibor the last word on that.
I just have a general comment to make, I suppose, that the thing that's been a kind of abiding theme for me through teaching both history and theory and design has been the essential reciprocity between the two, and that's something that seems to have been done better in the Cambridge School and through Dalibor's various studios than I've seen it done in most other places. And so I think that's, for me, that's a really important part of the legacy. The idea that the content of an architectural project should somehow naturally come out of the urban context, out of context, both physical and cultural. Anyway, that's a very general thing. But.
So the embodiment of the design studio,
Yes.
and the articulation of all of the rest of it. Is that what you're saying, or that you're saying
yes.
that it comes together in the design studio? I mean, if we're looking at actually what the educational situation is.
Yes, the fact that it was always taught together, but also that in Dalibor's case, unlike in most other cases I have seen, there was a very interesting architecture coming out of the philosophy, and that the two were always reciprocal. So I'm not sure if you want to call that embodiment.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, but now that you've brought up an interesting topic, this business of whether a cabinet of curiosities is just random discoveries. You know, here, Lorenzo, I found a pleasing stone that looks like a rat. Please take it with my best respects, and will you look after my mind? I think if you there's a long answer to this, which you could find in Claire Guest's recent book on ornament, where you get to see how the spheres of reference move between the situations in which they're manifest. So to find a piece of coral in a curiosity cabinet is, it's part stone, part plant, and you can't quite tell what it is, kind of thing. To see it in an alchemical text, to see it used rhetorically, you get a sense of how something like the Renaissance, Mannerism, and the Baroque could be both so metamorphic with the materials. I mean, the inside of Ziefalten or whatever is all plaster, except for the gilding, and mixtures with. I mean, it's a completely metamorphic world, animated by light, and the right through the seasons. And somebody like David Leatherbarrow was trying to get at, how to talk about this kind of thing. I mean, it's what he does. And the transformation of earth or water into lead is, I mean, Kiefer does his homework. He's not unfamiliar with these earlier forms of understanding, but when you see it live in the original culture, you get a sense of what it means to lose a culture and to find ourselves stranded in a world that is so full of freedom that it's a species of alienation. You really don't understand, you know, everything's possible and nothing's credible. And, oh, that's what you believe. You know, oh, that's a nice little pairing of, you know, Carl and Rat. It's, you know, thank you very much. And this is where, in fact, surrealism is an interesting problem. The L'Autrement table, you know, operating table with a sewing machine and umbrella, is a license to kill. You know, how do you know what's a good one? What is a good operating table or even a good umbrella? And in architecture, there's a lot more going on that helps you. And when one says that, you know, Earth is already architecture, you have a decorum, you have an orientation, you know, that you grow up with. It's like what Gadamer says about praxis. You can't put it as make a theory out of it. You can't make a recipe out of it. You have to learn by doing it. You have to live it. You know when to defer, when to be aggressive, or maybe you don't, but those are the opportunities that are presented. And I think I showed a couple of shots from the Kay brothers, and one was from their Street of Crocodiles. In the original book by Schultz, there is a hilarious but very worth reading section called something like The Treatise on the Tailor's Dummy Part 2, a second Genesis, in which he says matter is always waiting to be made alive. And he goes on, I mean, the whole book is like that. Pots talk, floors have personalities. And this is, you know, this is where latent world is potent, because it still does communicate. It's not like the floor talks about data. You know, the floors have only certain topics. They can be seas, they can be horizons, but they probably can't be data. They probably can't be a donut. Probably can't be a rat. And so this business of a latent world and having an order, and I mean, justice and paperclip simply don't have the same depth of meaning. They aren't equal. And to that extent, this business, this kind of tension between latent world, which seems very, you know, it's almost like space. Anything's possible and everything's hidden in it. And something like attunement to the cosmic conditions, there's like okay, how do you get from there? Well, it's not completely free, it's not completely blind, and it's not something that you can turn into kind of Cesare Ripa, you know, iconologia. It's built around things like feelings, like orientations, like fear and hope, and, you know, being oriented. So it's not like latent world is a general. There's a really rich and thick order built into that phenomenon.
Okay. Would anybody like to try and follow that? Now, can I open it up now to the floor? I think it would be lovely to hear from other people at this point. Yeah. Yes.
Peter raised this, I think, interesting point of, obviously, Dalibor not hating science. This, indeed, one of the, I suppose to try and open this out, one of the tantalizing things as a student was to have this sort of rich parade of culture that kind of thinned to a kind of shallow stream in, certainly in terms of the material that was presented to us in terms of the 20th century. And I remember wondering, are we allowed to like Aldo Rossi? Things like this. And then on the other hand, you'd sort of talk with Dalibor, and he'd have these kind of vivid anecdotes of the NASA experiments on sensory deprivation. And so he was, as Peter says, he was utterly fascinated by the kind of disembodiment of modern culture. I suppose the point I would suggest is perhaps that this is a kind of fairly baffling kind of pairing or split to try and bridge, but in a way, the lack of concrete examples that were offered us in terms of how to do it, how to kind of fill that gap, was possibly one of its most fertile aspects.
Just quickly, this will come up in the next session. Sorry, this will come up in the next session. Tanazi is very vehement on precisely your last point.
All right, good. There's another comment. Yes, please.
Mark Power, I'd like to just respond to William's comment in saying that I remember one conversation in one of our sessions with Dalibor about whether what we were doing in our design studio was right. You know, is this the right thing to do? And here he sort of replied to us with a sort of poem, which is right. It's sinistra. And it's taken me a long, long time really to sort of be satisfied with that answer. But I think in that he was saying he was making reference saying, I mean, I think a lot of us will have heard him say it's good and bad. And I think in a way he was referring to Roman culture. He was referring to the ominous, the idea that the augurs would look for signs, and they wouldn't necessarily bode well or ill, or they would bode both. And I suppose, you know, a term like sinister, when you first hear it told to you as a young person by a teacher, you tend to sort of think in a very shallow way about what that word might mean. You know, sinister, it's something spooky, you know. But it's actually, you know, and it probably represents how devalued some of those terms have become. But of course it captures a spatial idea. It suggests something that's hidden, and most importantly, it suggests that the most important thing is not whether things are good or bad in architecture, but whether they have meaning or not. Sorry, that's really confused.
Yes, over here.
This is a question to Dagmar. I'm Joseph Bedford. Full disclosure, I'm doing a PhD on Dalibor at the moment, so some of these questions are sort of premeditated, but this one's specifically raised in Dagmar's paper, and I hope it maybe responds a little bit to William's point. This, and a little bit to Peter's. The second form of latency, the theme of the crisis of technology. I was really taken by the description, Dagmar, that you made of the studio culture in Prague, as I think you described it, a semi-private, subversive space of activity. And it's tempting to see the studio culture in Cambridge in very similar terms, that the paradigm for the quality and the atmosphere of a Cambridge studio shared something with the dissident culture of Prague. But the question then is, what of the analogy between totalitarianism and the contemporary horizon that we live in? To what extent was the crisis and the theme of the crisis in Husserl related to the very specific history of Prague in those days? And to what extent did it carry over, such that as the theme of the crisis is rehearsed, there's this sort of projection of the idea that the world outside the studio in Cambridge has totalitarian qualities. I guess I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Would you like to respond?
Well, yes, there's a lot of different comments in there. I think totalitarian is a very strong term to use in terms of, in the context of modern-day Britain or the architectural world. That's one thing to say. The other thing is that totalitarianism in Prague really only started in around 1948 when the communists came into power, so a relatively short-lived, recent and short-lived phenomenon. That's the other thing. I think artists and architect studios tend to be subversive. That's part of their nature. Certainly with the rise of the avant-garde, you have this sense of the artist working against the stream of mainstream culture, and that's part of the excitement, and that's all part of the studio culture. So I suppose there is that to be found. Certainly I remember the architectural studios in Cambridge and indeed at the AA, that there is this kind of secret excitement about what's going on that other people may disapprove of. So that's inevitably there. Is that roughly what you mean?
Yeah, I raise it as a question for the day, as a sort of question mark over the theme of crisis, in the sense of what is the difference between a democracy, Britain, the time in which Dalibor was teaching post-68 as a democratic culture versus the context that inframed the early thinking in Prague as a totalitarian culture. It's a question mark about the elision, to some degree, between the two historical frames and the degree of freedom in each. And maybe just to finish, to what extent is the theme of the crisis actually of benefit to creating a very exciting architectural education? To what extent did the totalitarian culture create the dissident activity and make it stronger, more flourishing and more creative? And therefore, do you need the figure of totalitarianism in order to create this energy and enthusiasm in the studio?
Yes. This is an argument that's often made, that under the various communist regimes that the artistic culture was the stronger because there was so much to push against. This is something that Drahoš could perhaps comment on. And it is the case that now in places, I happen to know Prague, but I'm sure it's the case in many of these post-communist places, that with the advent of mass capitalism, mass consumerism, there seems to be, and the changes, the attendant changes in funding structures and so on, there seems to be a decline in some forms of creativity. So, for example, Schwankmayer says that their funding has dried up, and so now he has to make films which sell. And, that creates a set of problems, set of limitations, and so forth. So it's not all bad under socialism, actually, for the arts. Yes.
I just wonder if, instead of putting it in terms of totalitarianism, could it be more generally seen in terms of just politics and politicization? And that obviously we look at different periods, and especially if you take Dalibor's teaching career from 1968 until 2004, and then beyond that as well. Students have changed, and it goes in cycles to some extent. And we can look now and say, well, that students seem to be becoming more political again. And in some ways, yes, it is looking like the late 60s, but in a lot of ways, of course, it's something completely new that we're dealing with. And is this, is this really to do with the political nature of a design studio? What does that give us? I mean, does that make sense in terms of what you're talking about, or are you talking much more specifically about totalitarianism?
Yeah, no, that makes sense generally. Yes. I think it's maybe the point is the political nature, even though politics was often not necessarily spoken of explicitly within Dalibor's studio teaching, it was there in an implicit register through this atmosphere. And I think maybe that's what you're saying, that there's a real political commitment in the teaching, even if politics isn't discussed.
Yeah, Chris.
Hi, it's Christian Frost. I've wanted to go back a little bit, actually, to talk about this question of authenticity or Western civilization that you brought up. Currently, I'm working on festivals and architecture, and that's very much come out of my studio time I spent with Dalibor and Peter. And one of the things I think that's threatening in a different sort of way is that if we say that there isn't any sort of deeper experience that can be transferred, I accept your point that it might be diluted if we think about it in very simple terms, is that you end up with people currently saying about Florence, for instance, that because more people visit the churches as tourists than they visit them as churches, that they actually are more significant as museums than as remnants or aspects of culture that have a deeper meaning. And one of the things you recognise when you go to a festival at Florence, so there's some of the existent ones, is that even Japanese tourists who don't necessarily have any understanding of the depth of civic culture that is being manifested through the festive activity, understand it through association with their own traditions in their own countries. So even though the Christian tradition maybe relates specifically to Christian traditions, there's something deeper going on, which is, I think, what Dalibor would talk about as sort of this latent idea of culture. And I think it's an important point to make, because otherwise what we're talking about is knowledge. That if you have to know why you're experiencing something in relation to a festival, then that's different from experiencing the festival. It's not necessarily the same thing. And this is, I can't give you an answer to that yet, because that's work I'm working on at the moment. But nevertheless, I think there's a distinction there, which means that there is an engagement beyond Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll hold you to the answer, but no, I just think. Okay. Right, we've got that straightened out. No, and what I do think is that there's a deeper problem than that. I agree with you completely. The experience is absolutely critical, and the latent sense comes through there in that. But I mean, if we're going to just remind ourselves that there is the articulation side as well, I think the question of where knowledge does come in and how that comes together with the experience is really quite important. And I mean, that goes back to what Mari was saying, that there is some sense of totality in how the whole thing operates. But I think the other thing, though, about non-Western, and I mean, I don't even like using the word non-Western cultures, but it's going to have to suffice, I think, so that we know what we're talking about, more or less. And that is, it's not simply a matter of when people from other cultures come into the West and say, this is interesting, or I enjoyed that very much, or whatever the Japanese tourists are doing in the Florentine churches. It's when the culture is outside of the West, it exists outside of the West, and there isn't that connection. It doesn't have so much to do with tourism and so on. But, things that have come up through other traditions. And with less crossover. I mean, we could argue that today, of course, everybody is influenced by everything for various obvious reasons. But nonetheless, I think we can still talk about reasonably distinct cultures, that have certain things about the way they are. And and then there's the question of can we say embodiment and articulation and communicative space and so on. And really for me, it is a question at this point. I think sometimes it works well. I think sometimes it's really problematic. And I think probably it is not helpful to come up with just a solution to it, but we probably need to understand where it works well and where not much better. Anyhow, who else? Yes, please.
We have been talking about capitalism and about socialism. Those are systems which are very much suppressive. But each action is causing a reaction, as Newton said. And therefore, the underground movement was so important in Prague and in other countries that it created its own culture, which was completely different than the official realism. And that was the most beautiful thing. Unfortunately, in architecture, it cannot be manifested, because architecture cost money, and a lot of money. And therefore, it was not possible to transfer those thinking into architecture. But if you look back in, say, Baroque or Rococo, as we have the beautiful church on the screen there, the light dominates the interior so much. And Dalibor was fascinated with light and with the role of light in architecture, how we can enlighten that. It was not only Baroque, Renaissance architecture, it was also modern architecture. And the light, again, can play a very important role in architecture. So.
I think if I can just comment on that very briefly, looking at the flat, I had a very strong sense that there's a lot of play there with dark and light colors, that some areas of the apartment, the corridor and so on, is deliberately painted dark. It's a kind of chthonic region, and then there are areas which are fully illuminated by that long window. So yes, even there it comes across.
Yes.
Tim Goff. I just wanted to respond to Christian's point and also back to the question of crisis. We had an image from Peter of someone from another culture reading, and I was looking at architecture and continuity last night just to prepare for today, and I think one of the key moments there is the question of the primary reality of reading. This is the primary reality, and surely the question of Husserl's crisis is our distancing from that sort of primary reality. What Dalibor calls primary reality, and I don't see that crisis, which is a very general thing, and which he analyzes at the beginning of the 20th century as being related very much to totalitarianism. I think that's a kind of a different and more specific phenomenon, I would say. But then you could link this back to the debate that's going on between you two. Surely the question of whether and the extent to which something is accessible is the question of how primary do we get, or how latent do we get? And obviously reading is something that goes right across, as Peter already showed.
Can reading be pushed to interpreting?
Speaking personally, I'm with Christian on this. I'm not so worried about knowledge. I mean, I think that's less important. So therefore, the primary reality of reading. I mean, is reading to do with knowledge, or is reading to do with what happens, or what it does? I mean, that's another question altogether, and that varies across cultures and time.
One of the big themes that's going to come up in the next session is what a lot of the people called sharing, i.e. how urban blocks, for example, could be put together by different people. The degree of freedom, and it wasn't a master plan. It wasn't something that Dalibor divided up the site and said, you do this, and make sure there's a door 6 meters back from the pavement, or something like that. That It was a kind of mutual aggression, reciprocity, into the full spectrum between conflict, negotiation, accommodation, and collaboration. And I think what you're getting at with the reading, I mean, I think the distinction between what in the sciences is called theory and practice, or, theoretical and applied, is something, it's like public-private. It's one of these slogans that we carry around that has no gray area in it, and then actually all of it's happening in the gray area. It's all happening in the, a gesture is more articulate than just being able to stand in front of somebody. Language, I mean, this is one of the things that Dalibor kept stressing, he called linguality. And there's a thing in anthropology called the anthropological turn, where they're trying to take understanding of these deep contexts out of the, interpretation of the archaeologist or anthropologist, and see it as happening in that deeper context. So how a jungle is not simply a biological phenomenon, not simply an ecological phenomenon, but because of the claims of the various elements in it, from rivers to animals to illegal loggers and so on and so forth, there is a world that by which you're claimed when you join it. It's like going to another city. You can certainly go into most cities now and speak English, but the more you adapt to the local customs, the more profound it'll be. And so, I don't think there is a slogan, or what I'm slightly worried about, what Joe is asking, though I appreciate his question, is that, and I think your response that totalitarian is too strong a word, that what Dalibor was constantly working with was communication among very concrete situations, not relying on concepts, not relying on, axes or frontality or any of those. It was actually built out of the situations, and those require interpretation. It's like meeting somebody. You saw him yesterday, or you haven't seen him, or you're meeting them. I go to a Korean house, I take off my shoes, then what? I don't speak a word of Korean, but we can communicate. I don't step on their cat or whatever. Sorry, it's full of cats and rats this morning. But I think it's that's why the word communicative, which is unfortunately one of those words that can also be abused and turned into a slogan, at least point, and words like latent, at least point to the degree to which you're claimed by the concrete situation, and it's that all the problems of judgment happen. It's not about getting it right, it's about doing it well. And, that's a question of decorum and all sorts of things. And I think that when you start going to the larger public, I don't really have I'm really afraid of trying to come up with an answer for capitalism versus socialism. There's an interesting debate, i.e. between Hayek and Keynes, where the Keynes is the totalitarian version and the Hayek is the bottom-up incremental version. And that's usually missed in those debates because everybody thinks of capitalism as a system. And so and what constitutes a cultural economy? That was the name of a brief for one of the projects I just ran across at Cambridge. That's what you're really after. You can't, I think the systems, you go so far within the concepts that you think you're running the world. And then you go back and say, well, where did I start? I've left out most of what I need. And it's why you end up working with stuff that's much more clumsy than, the systems like axes or frontality or one of those. You're working with something that you just have to get involved with, and there's a question there of how deeply you get involved. It's like commitment or something like that.
Sorry, it's me again. I just wanted to also say something else in relation to what's being talked about, because there's an interpretation, or the idea that interpretation is something that is potentially implied as a continuity. We interpret in a certain way, and I think one of Kenneth Frampton brought up Walter Ong, or was it? It was Perez Gomez, Walter Ong's book on morality and literacy, when he actually says writing restructures consciousness. And I think one of the problems that we have when we're looking historically at the Baroque, and it also links into Robin Middleton's question, is that one is looking at architecture almost didactically, that there's this notion that there's a structure of the architecture which illiterate people could understand visually if they couldn't read. And my reading of these spaces is they're structured literally, even if they're structured pictorially. It comes from a literary consciousness. And this is certainly true of medieval architecture massively, and why it's led, I think, to so many misinterpretations. And I think Dalibor was very aware of that. He used to say you had to learn how to read a photograph. That people, the tribes, certain tribesmen who were shown a photograph of themselves didn't understand what it was because they weren't educated in visual culture. And so I think a part of all of these conversations, or the sort of points that were raised in many of these papers, are predicated on this relationship that there's knowledge based in literary culture that allows us to interpret these things, when in fact that wasn't necessarily the way they were seen at all in the first place.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to push too hard on the non-Western traditions, but I mean, I think there's still the question then of cultures that are not literary, that exist without that, and even today, those cultures still exist in, faraway places, and it just seems to me that creates a different sort of perception than when there is a very strong tradition of a literary culture. As you say, even if people are illiterate. But then there's also the cultures where alphabets are based on pictorial systems, and does that make a difference as well? Anyhow, I mean, that's getting into minutiae, but I just have trouble with taking that, across the whole board. I mean, if the literary tradition is there, fine. But if it's not there, then we need to be questioning, that idea, I think. Anyhow, there's going to be coffee. Oh, now all of a sudden there's lots of questions. I think there's one right up in the back corner. And was he first? Please talk.
Sorry. Well, my name is Amir Saad. I'm doing a Master of Studies course here. I'm writing my thesis about place identity in Cairo. So I was just questioning or actually I had a thought I would like to share, if I know your opinion about it, about the idea of authenticity. Because I was thinking about that authenticity may relate to the authenticity of culture, and the way in that time that we have all this cross-cultural interactions between different parts of the globe. So how much authentic does the culture of the people is? How much of it has been transformed and reinterpreted? And then how much does the built environment actually is keeping up with this transformation in culture, and how much is it authentic in terms of its representation to this current cultural transformations? So in what sense actually do you think we can tackle such a topic, and how can we discuss it? If my question is clear.
It's clear, it's big.
Okay.
Do you want to do that one? Or you?
Yeah, I think what Wendy says is it's big. I mean, this is the whole program that we're investigating it. I mean, the answer is yes and no. I mean, the London townhouse is easily adaptable to a clinic, a school, an embassy, and back to a house again. And so there's not a one-to-one correspondence between what the architecture is and what the culture is. That adaptability is something that modernist architecture is very bad at, but we'll go there perhaps next session. But what is already present in something like the London townhouse is an addressing the public life of a city. It expects it to be more public in the front and on the ground, you know, by the door, and more reflective and discreet and quiet up above. And that hierarchy alone is enough for very rich adaptation. And so there are points where, Ramses II will plaster himself on a pylon 4 times the size of a London townhouse and say, this is the meaning of this, particular condition, and I am the meaning, I am the pharaoh. But, people trying to win the competition for the government building for the fascist regime in Italy, doing a massive, 7-story high marble trireme, with ducks carved in letters taller than both of us on the front. That's so rare and so obviously stupid, it's not worth discussing. It's kind of interesting, I suppose. But the question of whether what we make architecturally supports a sufficiently rich culture is definitely up in the air. Even more the case, I think buildings, architects generally get right and do well. Where the problems arise is in the negotiation between the buildings and the city. Now that it's possible for big money to just kind of draw a line around a block, drop in a couple of lists and wrap a skin around it and walk home, and all the money goes somewhere else, that's much more damaging to the city than whether or not there's a pediment. Just in a short answer.
Okay. I think we have time. There is going to be coffee, and you've all been thrown off the deep end into philosophy first thing on a Monday morning, and everybody's done very well and deserves coffee. But I'm just wondering, there was a question up. Yeah, could we have that, and then we'll break after that one.
Thank you for the opportunity. I know probably you're all very tired. My question has to do with the subject of taxonomy and the Cabinet of Curiosities and Incarnation or incarnation. I was particularly compelled by the description on the West Portal that the continuity between subjects, beliefs, space would almost not allow the possibility of taxonomy. And one of the interesting topics of that is when we think of science today is how, as we struggle to make intelligibility of nature, is exactly that, the fact that nature, the more precise and specific it designs at given scales, the better the interdependency between systems is built. Therefore, today science, the way it begins to elaborate on taxonomy is exactly as a language that allows you to articulate differences between these scales, but at the same time, how to weave clearly those interdependencies. So could there be that there's potentially a meeting point between the role of taxonomy in a cabinet of curiosities? And if so, then what role does incarnation begin to play in the concept of the gray matter built?
Thank you for that. In Dalibor's little reading, I think, and certainly in his teaching, it's not like he was against taxonomy. He certainly took a lot from art history, he took a lot from science. But I think what that tiny little piece on Chartres, for example, is saying is that taxonomy is always provisional. And unless you realize that taxonomy is provisional and can never grasp the full hierarchy of meaning in play in any piece of a world, then you are in trouble. So as soon as you take the taxonomy for granted, or you take it as for being the full thing, the full order, Dalibor was very concerned with, for example, the transition in natural science from Linnaeus to late 18th century scientists, and where the taxonomy starts to pretend that it is reality, rather than, you know, a sort of provisional way of ordering which gives us knowledge and allows us to understand more, but which never would pretend to grasp the whole thing. And so I think his reading on the Chartres piece is interesting in that respect, because he in a certain way, he taxonomizes, you know, he uses the vocabulary of art history and draws on ordinary ways of describing these things, but he always warns you, as he did as a teacher, you know, this is not the full thing. Don't be fooled by the taxonomy, for example.
And that's exactly, sorry, 1 second, but the beauty with a cabinet of curiosities, right? Because it seems to be that it's exactly an artifice, but it's an artifice that allows for that plurality of almost provisional classification of components with an apparent lack of order, but it's still given an order, or not.
Yes, so I would say there definitely is an order to cabinets of curiosities, but it's a different sort of order, obviously from 19th century museums, and it's an order based in analogy, and that's where I think Dalibor's own collection bears some resemblance to the cabinets. But the cabinets were perfectly rational as well. You know, I mean, I've been reading about some of the apothecaries' collections, and there would be huge, hundreds of drawers of different sorts of samples, earths, for example, which were collected for treating various ailments, similar to modern pharmacies. But the ailments that they treated were ones which were somehow analogically tied to the material which the sample represented. So a different way of, quite a rich way of thinking about the world, I think.
Yes, the painters and the apothecaries were getting the same colors for the same reasons. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so there would be some particular sample of earth which was thought to be good for a particular condition, and then they would get the patient to wear it in a locket or apply it to their body.
But really different than the samples of earth that you'd find in a reliquary box, you know, which might also be seen to be having healing properties, yes. and yet at the same time, the reason for that would have been completely different than with the cabinet of curiosities. Okay. On that note, the healing properties of the earth, let's have coffee. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to the audience.